Hello everyone, this is Maz. If you're hearing this message, it means you're not part of the Voices of War subscriber community and will only hear the first half of the episode. If that's enough, then I'm thrilled. However, if you're looking to dive deeper into the complexities of war, please consider subscribing to our private feed by using the link at the top of the show notes. By doing so, you'll gain access to all of our episodes, the ability to ask follow-up questions, and we'll become part of an exclusive community that makes this show possible. I hope you'll make the decision to join us today.
The Donbas does have a unique regional identity, and that meant that it perceived itself as different from the rest of Ukraine. In a place where I thought I would be finding victims and recipients of humanitarian aid, I found people mobilizing very creative ways for responding to their situation. Over time, Ukrainians have become more and more aligned behind an idea of a civic identity that transcends ethnicity. There are really two intertwined crises in Ukraine. One of them is the military war. But there's another crisis that we don't hear as much about, which is a relational crisis in which people that were formerly close can no longer speak to each other or associate with each other. The prospects for peace will only come after there's a decisive military victory, because right now each country is staunchly holding to its own position and they're diametrically opposed. There's no overlap. There's no common ground.
My guest today is Dr. Greta Uehling, who is a lecturer at the University of Michigan and whose scholarship is broadly concerned with international migration and forced displacement. Her major projects have examined the experiences of refugees, asylum seekers, and the internally displaced. Her most recent project explored the subjective experience of the military conflict and forced displacement in Ukraine. Based on ethnographic fieldwork, she documented how the military conflict that started in 2014 reconfigured social worlds and how these social worlds became the site of a different, everyday kind of war. She recently published a book stemming from this research titled Everyday War: The Conflict over Donbas, Ukraine. I recently finished this book and found it an exceptionally human portrayal of war, as seen through the eyes of ordinary people living in a conflict zone. It describes the everyday struggles, reconfigured relationships, and adjustment to a new normal. But it also talks about the survival of friendships, hope, and humanity. Greta joins me today to discuss her work and to explore what it can teach us about the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Greta, thank you very much for joining me on The Voices of War.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here today.
So as I alluded to at the start, or before we started recording, I absolutely love this book because I think it spoke a lot to my own experience as firstly a refugee from Bosnia, from Sarajevo, and secondly as somebody who was separated from his father, who couldn't leave. So there was a lot of aspects of this book and adjustments to relationships, interpersonal relationships, to interethnic relationships, a number of dimensions that really spoke to me about this book. So firstly, I want to say thank you for writing it. I found it very insightful and deeply moving and very representative of the, in my view, experience of those who've gone through conflict. So thanks a lot.
You know, it's great to hear that, because I really believe that everyday war isn't isolated to Ukraine. And I think that it has broader applicability. And I wrote it hoping that it would also have broader appeal. So I'm really happy to hear that.
Well, it certainly does. And I have no doubt that it would very much appeal to any former Yugoslavs, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, regardless of whatever, ethnic persuasion they're from. It would certainly speak to them, because I think you really showed the nuance of these types of conflicts, where ethnicity is deeply intertwined with nationality, with identity, with language, and so on, which are a bunch of things that I really want to get to. But before we dive into, I guess, the book proper, I'm really keen to hear about your own background and how you firstly got into academia, what motivated that move, and then why did you dedicate so much of your professional career to understanding a place like Ukraine, and of course then the Donbas in particular?
I think that part of what got me into anthropology was growing up in a very ethnically and linguistically diverse community in Madison, Wisconsin. And you might not think of that as a particularly diverse place, but my family's house was near the graduate student housing. And so there were literally people from all over the world, and they, some of them became my close friends. And I think that experience really paved the way to a career in anthropology, because I began to feel at home when I was away from home. I developed a deep curiosity for people who might be a little bit different from me, or perhaps very different from me. And that became a comfort zone for me that served me very well once I was in the situation of, doing field work in a different country than my own. I went to graduate school. Actually, I should back up and I should say that my first job after I completed my undergraduate studies was helping refugees find jobs in the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was so wonderful. And I came to learn from their stories what it was really like to be a refugee in the United States. And I think that that experience helped me realize that learning from people's stories is something that I truly value. And I figured out I could translate that into a career as an anthropologist. And I've never really looked back, because, I think the beauty of anthropology is that it gives you the tools and the resources to step into another world, however briefly and to the best of your ability, in order to try to understand it from within. And I think that is it's a wonderful way to elevate the kinds of stories that otherwise might not be told.
And I'm guessing your first experience as trying to find jobs for refugees would have really set you up well for that kind of work.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that the book, Everyday War, contains a lot of people's stories, because I really wanted to provide an accessible lens for understanding the civilian experience of a country at war. And I think that makes the book accessible to a broad spectrum of people, because at one level you learn about people and their stories and what they went through. And there's another, academic layer that we can get into, but it can be read at both of those levels, so that it's available to a lot of different audiences.
Absolutely, and the academic layer that's in there is completely accessible as well. It's I actually found it really easy to read, and if you wanted to follow up on certain aspects and theories and thinking, there's room to do that. What is maybe let's get to the book, The Everyday War. What is the main thesis of the book? And you've kind of alluded to it already, but I really want to zero in on it. Who did you write it for? Who did you have in mind when you were writing the book? Who did you want mainly to pick up the book and read it?
Yeah, so the book explores the subjective experience that civilians have in a country at war. And I was motivated to write the book when I realized that conventional stories of war are incomplete. In a place where I thought I would be finding, victims and recipients of humanitarian aid, I found people mobilizing very creative ways for responding to their situation. And so what the title refers to, Everyday War, is the conscious and very creative ways that civilians, non-combatants, responded to the military conflict. And I'm really referring to a very pragmatic, self-defensive stance that's intended to maintain a livable world. And that meant, it happened at the level of action, whether that was driving to the front to deliver groceries to soldiers you believed probably didn't have enough, but there were also the relational elements that you spoke about at the beginning, which is that many people had to terminate personal relationships when they found themselves on opposite political sides. So the main thing about everyday war is that it's different than war itself because of the objective. So people who engaged in everyday war were motivated to preserve their caring connections. And Alexandra is probably the perfect example because she dropped out of her university studies when she realized that her father didn't have the equipment that he needed for his position as a sniper. So you may recall from those early chapters that her daily life was organized around drumming up donations so that she could purchase him things like tactical gloves and night vision goggles. And the reason that that's everyday war is that she was fully conscious that the people that he would be in a position to kill as a sniper were her former neighbors and friends. But she placed this very high value on his survival. So in a way, kinship had become tactical, right? She needed to ensure that he survived so that he could be there for her in the future. So everyday war is the primary motivation is preserving this livable world, a lived world.
And I guess the way I also took everyday war is that it's, well, as the title suggests, it's part of your everyday and it's all encompassing, and everything about your life is now deeply tied to that war. Whether it's finding means of survival in order to survive, whether it's finding equipment in order to help somebody like your father on the front lines to sustain the fight, whether it's reaching out to foreigners overseas to get aid, whether it's, as in this conflict, the current war or the invasion, getting onto Twitter to get support, getting marketing messages out there. And again, I can reflect on our own experiences as refugees in Germany, trying to send care packages to Dad in Sarajevo, who was a fighting age male and couldn't leave, would have been killed at the first checkpoint. We were trying to send care packages through Red Cross, Red Crescent, UN, etc. And some of these would get through, others wouldn't. But even things like coffee was currency in besieged Sarajevo. So small ways that we would try to, I guess, because you weren't allowed to send coffee into care packages. So small ways that we would contribute to that war would be, we'd get Nesquik, or cans of Nesquik, so chocolate drink, and we'd slowly peel back the metal, bottom of it or cut it out, fill the bottom up with coffee and, in vacuum bags, and then reseal it, put it back in. And these were kind of these small little victories for me as a 11-year-old child. This was a huge victory. I was part of the war effort. So when I was reading about the everyday war, these were the things that I was connecting with. And again, this is, for a child of, 11, 12, whatever, this was my way of contributing. And reading your book of all the different characters, they were finding different ways and means, I guess, to find meaning in this absolute senselessness that is the brutality of war.
Yeah. The Nesquik, I just have to jump in there about the Nesquik, because that is such a perfect example, because it speaks to the creativity, resourcefulness, resilience that people bring to bear on these terrible situations that they shouldn't have to be in, but they are. Yeah. So I love that example.
And the celebration when he gets through, I mean, it's indescribable, right? When Dad gets a bag of coffee that was stashed inside a Nesquik by his two sons, and his wife, who gave him this. Well, ultimately it was a lifeline, because not only could they have coffee, but they could trade meat for coffee, which is just incredible. You open the book with a really interesting discussion about the unique nature of identity of the Donbas. And given what's going on right now, and given the fact that the Donbas remains contested as we speak, what is unique about it, and why is this important for us to understand? In fact, it doesn't matter which way you lean, pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine, it becomes almost irrelevant when we start to unpack the identity of the Donbas. So maybe we can start with that.
That's a really important question. And I think that, the Donbas does have a unique regional identity, and that meant that it perceived itself as different from the rest of Ukraine. And that's important because the stories that you tell about your region shape who you vote for, the choices that you make, how you go about your daily life, how you perceive people in other parts of the country. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Donbas, it was really a hub for mining and metallurgy in the core. And then there was a sort of agricultural regions, farming that surrounded it. And that meant that, because of that mining and metallurgy, that meant that livelihoods in Donbas were much more connected to the economy of Russia than they were to the economy of Ukraine. And so when we could go back to the 2013-2014 revolution, and people hit the streets protesting the much-awaited association agreement with the European Union. And when it didn't go through, a lot of people protested because they were in favor of that European direction for the country. But as you can imagine, that all appeared very different from Donbas. Mm-hmm. That sounded like an existential threat to them, because if they went for European Union, that would mean everything from rebuilding the railroads to European specification, to revising their mining and metallurgy standards, to, different systems of measurement. It was comprehensive. And so they saw their lives and their livelihood many of them did more with Russia than Ukraine. So that was part of it. But as you allude to in the beginning, of course, it's always more complex than that. We can't boil it down to like a single cause. There were other factors like, within Donbas, people were divided. Some people were in favor of that European direction. Other people were in favor of a Russian direction. But what really tipped the scales was external facilitation from the side of Russia for the people who had a separatist mentality. And that meant, infiltrating local structures of governance with cadres loyal to Russia. It meant information war. It meant sending mercenaries to fight. All of those factors meant that the people in Donbas who favored the Russian direction prevailed.
Yeah, and I guess it was easy enough from Russia's end to fan or to increase the fault lines that already existed. So it was a rather easy victory to achieve, I guess, in the sense of undermining any bent towards the European Union. But one thing that I forgot to ask, and I think is really important for context, is to tell us a little bit about your fieldwork and how long you've spent in Ukraine, because not just in this project, but even before that, you've spent some time in the region. So it escaped me earlier, but I just want to let our audience know how deeply embedded you were in the Ukrainian society.
Mm-hmm. I first went to Ukraine in 1995 for my first field work when I was a graduate student in anthropology. And at that time, I lived uninterrupted in Ukraine for about a year and a half. And I was so immersed in the culture, that I started dreaming in the language, writing my grocery list in the language. And this was a time, I was living in Crimea, and at that time, that was before they had cell phone towers or cell phones. And so in order to call my family, I would have to go to the central post office and sign up for a telephone connection and hope to catch somebody at home. So I was very immersed in my situation. And I think that, the field of anthropology has changed quite a bit now that people are more interconnected around the globe. People do their work in a lot of different methodological ways. But for me at that particular time, it was very helpful to be so immersed that I was, I rented an apartment. I was just fully, that was my home. But for this particular book, I had a Fulbright research grant that enabled me to do research over a 3-year period. So I did 3 trips to Ukraine, and I interviewed about 150 people over that time span that contributed to the writing and publication of Everyday War, the conflict over Donbas, Ukraine. And the reason that it was called, that the book has that word conflict in it, was because at the time I was doing my research, that was the official international designation. It's only been since the February 2022 full-scale invasion that it was officially deemed a war.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
It's helpful to think of it in sort of 2 phases. There's this first phase that starts with the 2014 occupation of Crimea, which emboldens Putin to see if they can't also pull the eastern region in addition to that southern region of Crimea. And then the so-called conflict phase lasts up until February 2022, when we have this full-scale invasion that really involves all parts of the country of Ukraine.
And that's, I think, an interesting switch as well. And I think you highlight that towards the end of the book as well, as you relate your research from 2014 to 2022, I guess. And I found it particularly interesting how you talk about how the undeclared war, or the conflict that started in 2014, was perceived in unaffected parts of the country vastly differently to how it was perceived in the Donbas or in the affected parts. What was different, and what did you learn? What differed in those perceptions of the conflict, I guess, at the time?
Yeah, and for context, for my research, because part of my research focused on the people that had been internally displaced, and because they were dispersed throughout the country, I traveled throughout the country by train every year, so that I could visit different regions within Ukraine and try to get as broad a spectrum of perspectives as possible. And that's how I discovered that views really did vary quite a bit from one region to the next. And when I first began my research, I found that people in the western part of the country did not want their region to be drawn into the fighting that they knew was going on in the East. And many of them failed to see the utility of why their sons and daughters should fight to regain territory that, as far as they were told by Russian state media at least, had voted to, become more aligned with Russia. So they felt that, the eastern parts of the country apparently voted for greater unification with Russia. Why should we sacrifice our sons and daughters? And of course, there's also the element of time. With each passing year, Ukrainians became more and more anxious to simply return to life as normal, right? There's something that's so exhausting and depleting about living in a country at war. And so I think one of the coping mechanisms was to focus on their daily life and proceed as if it wasn't going on. And of course, those sentiments have changed dramatically since the Russian invasion in 2022, which posed such an existential threat against the whole country of Ukraine that, ironically, the Russian aggression against Ukraine that was intended to split the country apart and fragment it and decimate it, actually unified it, because once Ukrainians perceived the real nature of the threat, the scope of it, they became much more unified politically. And they also, we were speaking a few minutes ago about that regional identity in Donbas. Well, over time, Ukrainians have become more and more aligned behind an idea of a civic identity that transcends ethnicity. It's this idea that what unites us as Ukrainians is our values that we place on freedom and democracy. And irregardless of whether your ethnic heritage is Russian, Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar, or something else, you're Ukrainian if you identify as Ukrainian and if you embrace these values that we as a nation are embracing and trying to realize in the Ukrainian government-controlled parts of the country.
And I guess we see that now also extended to foreigners who've taken up arms on behalf of Ukraine. There's this kind of embracing in line with certain values, as opposed to nationality, ethnicity, language. And you see it also, Slava Ukraini, you see this everywhere, of people from all walks of life across the world who are in some way extending and sharing their support for what Ukraine, I guess, stands for right now, which again is another way of turning this into an everyday war, because it's through the social media, through the likes of Twitter, that people are participating, maybe not directly in hostilities, but certainly participating in sharing their opinion, their views, or sharing prominent thought leaders on the war in Ukraine. But also, one example that just falls onto my mind as well is I interviewed John Spencer, who's a urban warfare specialist from the US, who came up with a pamphlet effectively. I think it started with something like 21 tweets that was then collated as a urban warfighters manual that then became the go-to manual across Ukraine. He actively joined in many ways the war, although he did it from the US via Twitter, which again I find is a really interesting way of how it becomes everyday war for not just the people who are now in the conflict area, but those who perceive themselves as being part of the conflict, which is a really interesting dynamic that I guess we're seeing unfold right now with Ukraine.
I'm familiar with his work.
Okay.
And I'm glad that you brought it up, because one of the things that's interesting about it is just how specific he is, right? That manual on urban warfare is very street level.
Yeah, it's instructions.
Street level.
Yeah, street level for the uninitiated, non-military background, a layperson, I guess, which is
right.
Which again contributes to that everyday war, right?
Right. And I think my book is also at that everyday subjective, what do you need to do next level, but it focuses so much more on relationships and emotions, because what I found was that in the literature on war and conflict, relationships tend to be treated as like a tangent or a backdrop to the real action. But, I was telling you the story of Alexandra. And if we think about that, we realize that her activities were crucial to her father's survival. And there's so many other examples, when kinship becomes tactical like that, that it really does have an outcome for the people concerned.
No, absolutely, and that's absolutely the part I loved, and I've highlighted a quote. Even it's a small one, but I think it's opening of the chapter 3, where you write that the war in Ukraine has reconfigured relationships among people who knew, or at least they thought they knew, one another. What did you mean by this reconfigured relationships amongst people who knew, or at least thought they knew one another?
I was really, the majority of people that I spoke with, so it was like 67% of the people that I spoke with told me that they were mourning the loss of relationships. So it was one of those topics that came up time and again. And as an anthropologist, I like to work very inductively, which is to say, starting with the concerns of the people that you're talking with, instead of coming in with some sort of hypothesis that you want to test. So as a qualitative researcher, I was very concerned to start where people were at that time. And they told me unequivocally that the then dubbed a conflict was profoundly affecting their relationships. I think Larissa's story encapsulates these dynamics very well because she lost her only son to the fighting in eastern Ukraine. He enlisted at the age of 17 to defend Ukraine, and that would have been painful enough. Her only son. Except it was made more painful by the fact that her sister worked for the Russian-installed administration, and her mother had contributed funds that helped enable that Russian-backed administration to come to power. And so she blamed them in part for his death. So I think that that's a really good example because she realized that although she still loved her mother and her sister, she could not speak to them. She could not associate with them. It was just too painful. And she came to increasingly identify with Ukraine as her nationality, Ukrainian as her language, and began to find that there were certain things that she couldn't even express in Russian. She was so moved to align herself fully with Ukraine as a result of that experience. But I found sort of two strategies, right? So there was one strategy in which people ended relationships in which they were, when they found themselves to be on opposite political sides. That was one strategy. That was Larissa's strategy. Another strategy was simply to not speak about the topics that were contentious or difficult as a conflict calming mechanism. And that enables you to keep the relationship viable, but it's also a loss because it comes at the expense of having the freedom to speak of some of the things that are most meaningful to you.
Yeah, especially with your mother and your sister about the loss of your son. That you cannot speak about that would just be a second death almost. It's almost a second death of the son, right? So not only has he been killed, but I can't even mourn him, and therefore cherish his memory with my closest. So in a way, he kind of, Yeah.
Yeah.
You just never get to close that wound in any way. Well, not that it ever would, but you can't put any balm on that wound through those who you most want to share those emotions with.
Exactly. And, I keep thinking about, there's this cliche that war is hell. And I feel like the book adds a layer of meaning.
Yeah.
Because it's the kind of hell in which you can't call your parents because they're on the opposite political side. It's a relational hell. And that's why I think it's important to realize that there are really two intertwined crises in Ukraine. One of them is the military war that's being carried out as we speak. So there's the military crisis, with the loss of life, the loss of infrastructure, and everything that entails. But there's another crisis that we don't hear as much about, which is a relational crisis in which people that were formerly close can no longer speak to each other or associate with each other. And I think this is important to thinking about the conflict as a whole, because it's much more straightforward to rebuild the physical infrastructure, whether that's a power plant or an apartment building, than the interpersonal infrastructure, which is so much more difficult to rebuild and will take so much longer than the physical parts of it. And I don't say that to minimize the utter destruction, which is, unprecedented since World War II in Europe. I don't mean to minimize that. I'm just trying to say that, and there's another layer that we also need to keep in mind as we think about Ukraine.
And that layer is so structural. It's unseen, but it's structural in the sense that it's self-reinforcing, and it's then passed on to your neighborhood, to your children. It's passed on to the generation. And again, it's something we saw in Bosnia, and I'm just going to digress just to give you a small example of what I'm talking about. Some time ago, my partner and I, we went to Bosnia. This was in 2013, and we opened the country's first CrossFit gym. Don't hold that against me, audience, or you, Greta. We left the cult, so to speak. But we opened it as a not-for-profit to try and bridge the divide between the different ethnic groups in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, that existed between the local ethnic groups, but also with foreigners, because CrossFit had become something rather big globally, and it has the really incredible potential to build a community. And we used that to bring something different and new to Sarajevo, and we opened in the old Olympic Stadium. It was really powerful in that kind of symbolic sense, but perhaps the most powerful symbol of our 2.5 years while, establishing it and opening it and running it, we did a whole bunch of different charity work for kids with cancer, autism, etc. But we also did a blood drive for the local blood bank. And by that stage, we had coaches who identified as Bosniak Muslim, as Serb Orthodox, as Croat, myself as an other, as in non-religious, my partner who's Turkish background. So we're rather mixed. But perhaps the most powerful symbol was having coaches of different ethnicities sit next to each other, giving blood. And of course, the visual effect of all bleeding red. And I think this speaks to that, that point of the everyday peace, and this is where I want to kind of pivot to, but how people will, I guess, in a way, try to resist or reject the dominant narratives that try to divide them, but trying to find ever so slightly glimmers of hope in reconnection. And that connection, the human connection, is so... It is absolutely pivotal and critical and key to one's own, well, firstly, mental well-being, but also in, I guess, instilling some sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow or the next day, we might be together again, which is a really for nations that are divided internally. So this is not, they're sharing the same border. These are the same people in many ways. And all of a sudden they've been forced apart in many ways. This is, I think, what you're saying is this kind of trauma. This is the other war that we don't talk about. This is not the tanks. This is not the mortars, the artillery, the mechanical, technical, tactical war, but it's the deeply interpersonal, deeply soul destroying. I just wanted to use that as an example because that was one example where I witnessed the power of symbols and symbology and how, it went viral as viral could have gone in Bosnia in 2014, wow. This one particular image, because it was so, it just said so much, where you had, two coaches of different ethnicities bleeding red. I just wanted to share that example with you.
It's wonderful. It's such a great example.
And perhaps this is a good time to now pivot to this idea of the everyday peace, which I really, really loved about the book. I hope I get the sense it's really coming across how deeply engrossed I was in this book. But I really want to touch on some of these aspects of everyday peace. Firstly, maybe I'll let you define what you mean by everyday peace, despite how much we've already kind of talked about it. But I just want to give you the space to explain it through your words. And then I would like to touch on some of the examples of interpersonal peace that you have encountered that you mentioned in the book, because I think they're, again, really, really powerful of the kind of everyday aspect of war.
Yeah, happy to define it. Everyday peace is a concept that arose within peace and conflict studies to carefully consider the significance of non-elite types of actors. So not heads of states or diplomats or the military, but so-called ordinary people. And in the field of peace and conflict studies, they're really interested in considering how peace is enacted on multiple levels simultaneously. So, at the same time that leaders might be sitting down to the table to carry out diplomatic negotiations, it's very important what's going on at a local ground level. In fact, according to some ways of thinking, it's crucial to the sustainability of the peace agreements that do get signed, whether or not people in general are behind them and can sustain them. So this theory came about in peace and conflict.
If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode and gain access to all of the episodes of The Voices of War, simply become a subscriber using the link in the show notes. As you know, I will not feature any ads on the show, which is made possible solely through the support of our subscribers. If you find value in the content, you can become one now.